the PBS item on the agenda, which I guess in the last 12 months, PBS has seen a lot of changes in terms of, I shouldn't say changes, seen progression of the amount of equipment on the road. And I guess something that I've come across myself has been just probably trying to give people out there a better explanation or a better understanding of the process. So after sort of some discussions with Rob over the last couple of weeks, we thought that it'd be good to get different people on from the various stages or various requirements of the PBS process. So I thought that people are seemingly a little bit uneducated or unaware of what the requirements of PBS are. And I guess there's obviously the carrier's point of view, the manufacturer's point of view, PBS assessor's point of view, NHVR obviously involved in there as well, and then finally the certifier. So they're, I guess, the different stages or different people involved in this. And I guess today was just trying to get each of those guys to give us a bit of an explanation of where they fit in the picture, and then I guess some of the aspects around, route, mass, management of PBS within your business, and then also the resources that are required. So I think I guess the noise from my understanding being around the industry is that PBS is a system that's available out there. It's not a system that fits everybody's needs, but I guess the idea was just to get all the different people involved and I guess a warts and all explanation of PBS, how it works, what works successfully, and then also some of the potential issues and misunderstandings. I guess probably one of the biggest ones that I've seen. Sorry, I just accidentally muted myself. But yeah, biggest problem in my experience, both as McColl's and then most recently in the last 12 months, has been around sort of expectation of buying equipment and then getting it and having it on the road within the sort of week of getting that equipment. And if you look at that, the PBS process, very rarely, if ever, would that happen. So it's about trying to give people a better understanding of the system, how it works, and then also, I guess, trying to give people an education on the system, and then they can decide for themselves whether it makes sense for their business or not. Or potentially, a horses for courses scenario where it works in one particular state or application, but may not in another. So, so today, from the manufacturing point of view, we have Ben Lassetti from Time and Manufacturing. Ben's had an involvement prior to that with Vaudrey's through PBS. And I'll run through them first, and then I'll give them each an opportunity just to give them a bit of an overview of what they do in the process. We also have Les Bruiser, who is from the NHVR. Most of our members would be aware of Les over the last 10 or so, 15 years, and his involvement in PBS. We have Marcus Coleman from Tiger Spider, as a PBS assessor, and it's a bit hard at the moment, but it's Marcus's birthday today, so happy birthday to Marcus. Great to see him on board on his birthday doing a bit of work. So and then we move on to Bob. So Bob Edwards is the final or the certifier of the equipment. So if I just get you, Ben, just to give us a bit of an understanding of obviously timings, but I'm probably trying to look at less of a, what timings do, but how you fit into the picture in terms of a manufacturer rather than specifically just timing itself, I guess. So from a customer, I come along to you and say, I got this job, it's running from Newcastle to Mount Isa, and I want to run some equipment. What's the best I can do, or what's the biggest I can run? Um, how does the manufacturer fit into the picture from there?
No worries. Thanks for your question, Justin. Thanks for having me on as well, everyone. I really appreciate the request. So I guess the first and foremost thing that you need to think about with PBS is that do you have the right compliance and the right people within the business to manage the permitting burden and the everything that goes along with that, which we sort of touched on in the past. But I guess once we've broached that and we're sort of satisfied that PBS is, the right direction for the business, the first port of call is always looking at the start and finish locations, and then looking at the roads in between those two, because I think everyone's been around long enough to know that it's not what the vehicles not the vehicles that we can really build. We can build vehicles with many axles. That the critical thing is often what the roads actually say, and that always comes from, like I said, looking at what areas you're traveling through, what infrastructure there is, different ages, all that sort of jazz. So typically that guides us when we're directing customers with what sort of vehicles they might be looking to use to achieve higher payloads. And it also starts from what their current vehicle is. So, if they're on road train routes, they might be using a AB triple. We've got a vehicle that can supersede that and achieve more payload. Obviously, if they've got a B double, the next step up is an A double, and so on and so forth. So really, I guess that's the high level snapshot that needs to happen, and we sort of take it from there.
So thanks, Ben. If I take that question one step further and say, like, the next step is, say, you're going to an A double combination.
Yep.
What happens from a manufacturing point of view there, as far as how do you get the ball rolling in terms of making sure, like, do you go to a PBS assessor? Do you do the PBS process internally yourself? How does that work?
So predominantly we do all the in-house, we'd all the designing in-house, and then we get the PBS assessors to formalize the vehicle design a little bit further in the process. But I guess before that as well, we tend to do all our own access on behalf of our customers, because it's basically you're shooting yourself in the foot to supply someone equipment if they don't have any access first. That's one of the big takeaways from PBS as well.
Yep. And just one other question on that is, how do you find the process from a in principle approval to then going to an actual approval? I guess one of my experiences is what was on the in principle approval compared to what the actual approval ended up being, in terms of, say, a milk combination, for example.
Yeah.
Expectation was going to, say, 85.5 tonne, and I think in the end it was like a 75.5 or 75 tonne approval in the end. So it's sort of, I guess, the carrier's coming in looking to build a tanker that can carry a gross mass up to, or having a gross mass up to 85.5 tonne. Go through the right paperwork, send off the right information to PBS, NHVR. That in principle approval comes back, and then you get to a point where you go to put it on the road, and then that vehicle is like, oh, actually, we've looked at it now and we can only put gross mass up to 75 tonne on it. Does that still happen? Is it less frequent now? Is it something that still needs improvement?
I mean, there's always improvements that could be made in terms of the in principle side of things. The only time I've seen that sort of thing happen is if there's been a drastic change in the state of the bridge. I know there was a bridge just near Temora that got washed away recently. So that's obviously an extreme example, but if there's some adverse weather event had just caused its safe working load to go down, that might be one reason. But the other one that can sort of create a little bit of issue is when the vehicle is slightly different to what the in principle got assessed as. And as a trailer builder, it's a lot easier for us to control the trailer coming out with the right dimensions. And after 8 years within the PBS space, we sometimes still have issues with trucks not being supplied as we need them to. And that can create some problems from the in principle side of things. So unless something changes, it tends to go through pretty smoothly, but it's just whenever there's a change, the system doesn't seem to be set up for coping with the changes in an efficient and timely manner. So that's a big takeaway as well, that you want to try and keep everything exactly as the in principle was assessed. If you don't, you're just inviting the road managers, you're giving them an angle to basically change their decision. So.
Yep, very good. Thanks, Ben. Next one, I'll move on to Marcus. If you can just give us a bit of an understanding on building this A double combination through a manufacturer. The manufacturer comes to you as a PBS assessor. How does that work, and what steps are involved from your perspective as a PBS assessor in the industry?
Unmute. Okay, there I am. We're an assessor. We also do certification as well. So my brother Brendan, the certification inspection comes at the end, obviously, and then the permits. So the assessment is really the first step. Well, if we take a step back, PBS has got essentially two parts to it: the vehicle approval and the road access. So the vehicle approval is all predicated on a computer simulation of the vehicle combination. So we not only do the assessments, but we also develop our own simulation software called Heavy Spec. We've got another product called Spider Path, which I'll talk about in a second, and that's used for route assessments, swept path, particularly. So if it's someone like Ben who has our software, he would have assessed that combination and has a pretty good idea that it's going to pass. We provide that tool to manufacturers if they choose to use it, and they can have a pretty good idea as to whether the vehicle is going to meet all the PBS requirements, at what level it is. But often we'll get engaged when it's someone like Ben and the manufacturer's done a lot of work. It's relatively straightforward for us to basically go through and finalise the assessment, just check everything off and make sure it's all correct. Typically, the manufacturers will want us to cover off a number of different suspensions and tyres. Although the NHVR obviously recently has indicated that tyres will be taken out of PBS. Les might talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. We still don't know the detail on that. We have an in principle, approval from ministers, so it is going to happen, but the detail is still yet to be determined. So we don't quite have a time frame yet. But tyres has obviously been a big bugbear for PBS, but that will soon be resolved. But we still have suspensions and couplings. We have to check D ratings, make sure that they're correct. Check, as I said, rollover, which is not dissimilar to the SRT. So obviously PBS, there's a bit of crossover with AS 2809, which was recently updated and changed. So for those in the DG space, PBS is also an alternative to the typical stability angles. And ultimately that means there's a little bit more flexibility with specifying fill levels, rather than just the tank centroid and so it provides in some cases a little bit more flexibility, and that's often what we'll do with tankers in particular, is we have to consider things like slosh, how we're going to control the loads and fill levels, and oftentimes to get them to work, we spend a fair bit of time, running through numerous assessments and scenarios to get all and make sure all those permutations and combinations will work. And
in that instance, Marcus, that's a question from a bulk liquid carrier or position. So when you do your simulations and that for say a taut liner versus a tanker, the simulation is different in terms of you take into account safe fill levels, you take into account, I guess, dynamic stability on road. It's not just pallets put on here and it doesn't move in transit. You take that into account?
Yeah, look, there's two key differences. I mean, all trailers are subtly different. Tankers have a different requirement. Bulk tankers that are carrying dangerous goods, they need to meet a higher roll stability threshold, 0.4 G. Non-DG tankers don't have to meet that requirement. So sometimes we'll have combinations which are, or tanks set up that are both DG and non-DG. And so we might be able to have, different fill levels or less stringent requirements on the non-DG mode. We do have to consider slosh. Sometimes we consider slosh by modelling it, and we will model there's mathematical models that we can use to simulate the behaviour of slosh, and that's a function of the viscosity of the liquid and the size of the compartment. And other times we'll just control it through basically controlling the ullage, specifying, say, if you meet the ullage requirements, effectively that negates the slosh, and we can assume that it's not going to be a problem because less than 15, as per the DG code, you're either less than 15% or more than 85%, and that basically slosh really occurs when you're about half full, and if you're full, it doesn't sort of have too much of an effect. And we've also done testing in the past on tankers. The reality is it's only certain commodities that really are affected by slosh in the lane change, because it's a specific frequency of manoeuvre. And so I think it's caustic soda and things like that, they can be a bit of an issue, but for the most part, it doesn't really behave that bad, provided you've got baffles and stuff for PBS. So yeah, that's what we need to consider. So that's largely what we do with the assessment. It's always about trying, because we're always pushing it to the limits, always trying to get as much weight and as much volume as possible. And that's where we spend our time, is really trying to refine that and optimize the design as much as possible.
Mark, it's Rob here. Deb Kirk's just made a note that the ADG code is specific on ullage for tankers, and her note says you can't alter this via PBS without an exemption from the Competent Authorities Panel. Is that your experience?
We don't alter the ullage requirements for the DG code. We will sometimes leverage that, and we will specify that and call that out on the design approval. So in theory, you could remove the ullage requirement from the dangerous goods code, but we've got it on the PBS approval, and we refer back to that generally. So we're not changing the ullage requirement of the code. We're just leveraging that for the PBS. So, and sometimes we'll specify specific fill levels, which will go over and above the DG code. So we're not changing the DG code, but we're entitled to specify whatever conditions we like on the PBS if it needs them.
Yep. Thanks, Marcus. Another question on that. In terms of, so you verify the design and go through and meet the parameters of the NHVR. So do you then submit it, or does it then go back to Timans to submit? on their behalf, or do you guys do it directly?
Design approval must be submitted by the assessor, and the certification must be submitted by the certifier. We'll often do access as well, and obviously we want to help operators, particularly if they've got existing equipment for A-doubles. So it'd be quite common. They've got some existing equipment, either a truck and dog or some A-double road train combination, for example, that they've been operating in New South Wales and want to come into Victoria. We've got to do an assessment for that. So it's not new equipment. So then we'll provide advice around, okay, well, what networks are going to be available? Are you going to need a bridge assessment? What's the optimal dolly length? Do you need to modify these trailers at all? What sort of brake kits? Is the braking system up to spec? Often most tankers and a lot of trailers will have ESC, for example, but the dolly might not. And at the moment, it'll need load sensing. So we'll often have to make sure that gets installed before we can finalise the certification and the assessment. It's more of a certification issue. So we submit the design approvals. We'll often advise, and manufacturers might do this, and certifiers, other consultants, help set up the approvals within the transport operator's account through the NHVR portal. So we can be an agent to help set it up, and then they technically have to submit the application for a permit. So that's the road access, the permit side. That has to be done by the operator. They own the permit, if you like. They own the approval if we're doing the PBS approval for them, or it could be we're doing it for a manufacturer. We've got our own blueprints as well, which we've got pre-approved, so that they can just get them certified, so we don't have to wait. So that just gives them a menu of, so there's a few different options in terms of the design approval, but the road access and the vehicle approval will always come back to the owner of the asset or the operator of the vehicle.
All right, thank you. I'll move on to, thanks Marcus, we'll come back a little bit later. I'll move on to Les. Just Les, if you can give us an understanding from the NHVR point of view now that that the PBS approval has been lodged with the NHVR, what happens from there?
Thank you, Justin, and thanks for the opportunity. Just before I get into the process, I guess what Marcus mentioned, that's probably the key element, that this whole process is separated for the vehicle approval part and for the access part, and this is how the current legislation covers PBS. And while it's absolutely fantastic that PBS is now part of the National Heavy Vehicle Law, so the vehicle assessment part is really covered by a legislation, and that's very unique for Australia, because there is no way any other country which would have a fully comprehensive performance-based set of legislation for heavy vehicle weights and dimensions. So while it's there, and therefore then HVR would have the legislative power to assess these applications for the vehicles and make a judgment that yes, they comply with the standards or not, or the requirements or not, and therefore issue a design approval for the concept vehicle and the vehicle approval for the final vehicle when it's hitting the road. So that's the vehicle assessment and approval process. Obviously, we are working together with the PBS assessors, manufacturers, and also the certifiers. And even though that we are managing the access side of it for the jurisdictions which are part of the National Heavy Vehicle Law, so obviously 6 jurisdictions, we still don't have WA and the Northern Territory. In those cases, this is more like a management role, because the current heavy vehicle law doesn't give us a power to issue or a permit to approve the operation of a vehicle on a particular road without the consent of the road manager. So what it means that we are processing those applications, we are dealing with the road managers, but at the end of the day, under the current legislative environment, the decision is with the road manager to allow the operation of a vehicle on a particular piece of road. So I think it's very important to understand that that element.
Les, do you think that'll change in the future, or is there a plan to change that? It just seems that sometimes the NHVR is held to ransom by a local road manager, or not necessarily held to ransom, but just seems limited by what they can do, I suppose.
It's a very tricky area, and obviously currently we have the review of the National Heavy Vehicle Law, and we've got a number of proposals with the NTC, what they are considering in reviewing the legislation, which would help to give certainty to operators. And I guess that's the critical element from the operator's point of view, to have a certainty, to make it sure that that if you invest your money into the development of a PBS combination, then you need the certainty that you will have a chance to operate that and run that under those conditions what you expected for that combination. Having said that, we are working on a number of there are a number of legislative sort of tools to making sure that there is access provided for combinations, and these are the notices or the pre-approvals which can help the industry to gain that confidence. But my personal view is that there won't be any fundamental shift between the road managers or road authorities and the NHVR in terms of access approvals, because at the end of the day, they are responsible for their road infrastructure. The other important element, and I just would like to mention two things, that we've got recent reports which are demonstrating that the PBS fleet is delivering significant safety and productivity benefits to the society. So it's not a surprise that we see the PBS numbers going through the roof. While 7 years ago, when we took over the management of the scheme, we had around 1,200 combinations on the road. Now we are exceeding 12,000 and getting close to 13,000. So there is a significant growth in the scheme because operators are realizing those benefits what these combinations can deliver. What it means, this huge growth, just to give you an example, last month we issued 274 PBS vehicle approvals. So that's the actual final piece of document what you need to operate a vehicle. In the first year of PBS operation by the NHVR, for the whole year we issued around 400. So in this year we issue in 1 month 270, while 7 years ago it was 400 for the whole year. So that's a huge workload for us, and also that raises lots of management issues and administrative issues which are around the operation of the PBS vehicles.
Okay, thanks, Les.
So just one more thing. So
Yep.
so we received the application from Marcus. We check if it complies with the standards. We issue a design approval. The vehicle gets built by Ben. Then it's going through the certification, and probably Bob Edwards will talk about that. And then we get the certification document. We issue the vehicle approval, and then the access permit can be issued. One more thing, then I shut up. That that unfortunately you mentioned the in principle approval process for access applications, and that's really a difficult one because that process is not covered in the legislation. So while if you lodge a proper access application for a PBS vehicle, at least there are some guidelines around it, some safety guidelines in terms of hoping that road managers will be responding within a certain period of time, and there are some safety marks there. Within principle, that's not part of the process. So this is why it's much more difficult in terms of the legislative process.
Excellent. Thanks, Les. So now we'll move on.
Before Les goes, Justin, just throw tyres back into the mix, please. And that was one of the
you just couldn't you just couldn't resist. And you know, Marcus, this is your birthday, but you just had to raise the tire issue. But no, it's been around for a long time, and yes, it's been
that's a tire joke, Les.
and I guess I have to remember that ARTSA was having a PBS conference back in 2013 when the most important issue for PBS was the tires. So it's been a long process. Yes, the ministers supported the NHVR's proposal for the introduction of a generic tire system. So what it would mean that PBS assessors would be using general tire data sets when they are making their assessments. And if the vehicle passes the standards with those generic tire data sets, then operators will have the flexibility to fit any tires from the market. So that's gonna reduce lots of that administration around PBS, and probably make it more practical and operationally easier for managing a fleet of PBS combinations. What's happening, we are going through our internal sort of policy development. The next step is to develop these specific data sets for the different tire sizes. And we've got some ideas about that, and we're gonna have consultation with the PBS assessors in the very near future to see what would be acceptable or what wouldn't be acceptable. And there are two steps left in the process. The first is looking at what is the implementation policy? What do we do with the existing fleet? So how do we grandfather the existing combinations? What do we do if operators are adding vehicles to existing approvals? And how do we handle that? So there are some implementation policy issues which are outstanding. And the third one is we have some legislative issues what we have to work out, and that's updating the current PBS standards and vehicle assessment rules with those technical tire data sets to make it sure that PBS assessors will be using those. We would like to introduce the new scheme before the end of the year. So that's it has a very high priority in the management within the NHVR. So we are putting lots of resources in resolving those outstanding issues. And I'm hoping that we would get support from ARTSA members in terms of progressing that proposal and implementing it as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Les. If we can just move on to Bob. If you can just give us a bit of an understanding from a certifier's point of view, the equipment's been built, it's about ready to go on the road. What happens now?
Thanks, Justin, for that. Yes, once the design approval's been issued and the client comes to us for a final inspection, and that can be a range of transport operators, individuals and manufacturers, we're presented with a document that comes out of the vehicle approval called a Part B. And Part B specifies all of the critical components of the vehicle: engine, transmission, driveline, suspensions, tyres at the moment, And I suspect there'll still be some tyre size considerations in the future. And armed with that, we undertake an inspection of the whole vehicle to see that each of those bits from the front to the rear in terms of those components I just talked about are as specified. We complete the Part B. We check the dimensions of the vehicle from the front, from the front projection to wheelbases to axle spacings, fifth wheel positions, drawbar lengths, correct brakes, all those components. So we inspect all
With that,
those.
Bob, sorry to interrupt. If just to go back on Ben's point earlier about truck coming out differently to what was in the
Yes.
in the approval or the tanks. I guess the tanks I've built never come out the same as what they did on a CAD drawing or on a desktop computer. So what sort of tolerance is there in there for movement of turntables? Obviously maximum overall length is obviously important, but in terms of getting correct axle grouping weights right.
The longitudinal dimensions in particular have a 1% tolerance and maximum of 20 millimetres. So, if you've got a 5 metre wheelbase, 1% of 5 metres is a lot more, is 50 mil? Yes. But we're limited to 20 mil variation on what was approved. I don't like being that close because all these measurements are generally done with tape measures and plumb bobs and squares, and I like to be far enough in that if someone else comes along and has to measure it, I'm not going to say that I've got it wrong. So we're talking about 1% or 20 millimetres for a tolerance. Now, if you talk about fifth wheel position, for example, that might be 100 millimetres ahead of the centre of the axle group. 1% that is only 1 millimetre. That's not that easy to measure with a tape measure. So nevertheless, it's there. So they are the tolerances, and sometimes they're not right. And there are options available then of the operator or manufacturer correcting it, or going back to the assessor, as we were able to do, and get an assessor sign off on some of the variations that may have been made rather than have to change the vehicle. Clearly, you're not going to change the length of a tank on a tanker. You're not going to relocate the suspension and axles. We've certainly had a few where they've had to change drawbar lengths and relocate fifth wheels.
Bob, how often do things fail, and what are the typical failures? Is it in the truck or the trailer? And in your experience, how often do you have to put in a negative report?
I've got to pick a number now, but I would have thought in the past it could have been in the order of 30%. Often minor and rectifiable. Wheelbases sometimes on dog trailers in particular can be an issue. Sometimes that's just that they haven't been wheel aligned properly in the factory. I think wheel aligners sometimes only care about the two axles in an axle group being parallel and not getting too fussed about the actual wheelbase. We do get some variations in truck wheelbases that manufacturers have specified a number, and less often, but we've certainly had some in the order of 25 mil difference. Often we can work with that as long as the design approval hasn't tied the wheelbase down too tightly. We can move on that. So that are the sort of things that happen that in a lot of cases are rectifiable without major work.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, okay. No, so anyhow, we just put the certificate into the regulator, and then they review it. And if I've got any questions, I'll come back. The timing at the moment is not too bad on that sort of stuff. It was a bit of a problem a few months ago, but that's sorting itself out, I believe, fairly nicely now.
Yep. Thanks, Bob. I just wanted to get opinions from you guys just around, I guess, from a carrier's point of view. I see the two biggest pitfalls that I've seen a design approval for a vehicle that gets in principle approval to go to maximum GVM, whether it be under HML, for example, or IRP. And then when it goes to actually getting approved, it takes, I'm not saying it doesn't get approved, say an A double to 85.5 tonne, but there may be a delay that you can then operate the vehicle for the next 10 or 12 weeks, only at a lower mass. I know, we had milk tankers that were running around at 68.5 tonne that were capable of 85.5 tonne, for good sort of 6 to 8 months before we could actually get to that higher mass. And the other one, from a carrier's point of view, is buying the equipment, getting the equipment to your yard, and then what's a reasonable expectation of having that equipment in the yard before you can actually load the tanker? Most people that I talk to from a pitfall of a PBS is that you're buying the equipment, you're getting it in your yard, and it could be 8 to sort of anything from sort of 6 to 12 weeks in terms of, getting it there suitably and then actually loading it up and doing its first delivery. So it's sort of, I guess I'd be interested in your opinions on those timeframes, just so that people understand that and say, well, if I buy this piece of equipment, I get it to my yard on a Monday, it doesn't mean it's going to be on the road and working on Tuesday. It could be, a 6-week period, or an 8-week period, or a 12-week period. So I'll just start with Ben, if you could just give us your thoughts on those two things, and just an awareness, I suppose, of what actually is happening in terms of real time at the moment.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the first thing to probably think about is those timeframes that you've quoted, have they been over the last 4 or 5 months while the PBS team has had their lag issues?
I would say I'm talking probably the last 2 years.
Okay. Look, notwithstanding the lag issues that they did have, as long as we can bring the vehicle approval together in line with the in principle, our timeframes, the general timeframes that we've been able to achieve are, probably in the 3 to 4 weeks range. Those longer term timeframes that you were talking about, I'm sure there's some sort of extenuating circumstances, especially if it goes beyond 2 months. That's very long. But just as an aside as well, another issue with some of this PBS vehicle is actually moving it around we have to do it as class 3 delivery movement permits and stuff like that. And that's very clunky, and it's not very efficient as well. I think I've heard that the access team at the NHVR is looking at ways, or maybe that was one of the states was looking at a better way of doing it. But, we have to get in some of these delivery permits a month, 6 weeks before the tanker is actually going to be certified and ready to roll, just so we can actually move the thing. So I think as long as you do the delivery permit in a timely fashion, and like I said, the VA and the in principle align pretty well, you can generally get that stuff down. But I think some of those longer timeframes you were talking about were that the access wasn't in place, and that sort of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, that you really need access before these things are built. So,
following on from that, though, the reality is that you can't get access until they're built. So, because you've got to understand that the way that the system's set up, the vehicle approval needs to be, that's upon a vehicle. So you can't certify the vehicle until it's built, and you can't request a permit until you've got a vehicle approval. So the system's got inbuilt into it a delay. Now, in some instances, they've got, and this is what we trying to encourage, and the NHVR, I think, is trying to work towards this, is networks which give as of right access. So, and like truck and dogs, for example. Now, there are a few truck and dog tankers, probably not as popular as tippers, but they've got a network. They've got as of right access. They don't actually need a permit because they can operate under the National Truck and Dog Notice. So what that means is the vehicle approval effectively is your permit and away you go. So you can pretty much be up and operating day one. The same is true for level one. If you're a level one vehicle, maybe a semi-trailer, a quad semi tanker, if you're applying for, or if you've got meet PBS level one requirements, you can operate general access wherever you like once you've got a vehicle approval, but only up to 42.5 tonnes. Now, that you'll say, well, that's useless to me because I need 50 tonnes, and that's fine. You want the higher weights, but it does give you that flexibility to move the equipment, to at least do something with it. Also, if you coming back empty, you've got more of a flexible network, and that the same is true for PBS level 2B, say an A double in Victoria. If you've got networks, you can leverage that network. So put a permit application in for say 68.5 tonnes. Yes, it's not what you want, but at least you've got a network, a base network where you can move the vehicle on and be operating up more quickly. And so you need to kind of think about those permits as more of a building. You'll build upon a permit. So get a base at, say, if you're a level one vehicle, you've got the general access, which is your base. If you're a level two vehicle, get it at 68.5 tonnes or a tier one approval. And then the tier three will take longer. Other states are different. So the other thing is to note, to understand is that PBS on the NHVR, in the NHVR context, is really Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland and South Australia, but the eastern side of South Australia. WA, Northern Territory and South Australia increasingly now have got a different PBS system, if you like. So they do it a bit differently. So the opportunities in WA are quite different. And you can, and for example, Main Roads WA does all the certifications. So they don't have independent certifiers. So they'll just book it in and certify it and do the inspection. So the road agency does that. Design approvals are roughly the same process, but they've got a different set of standards to accommodate bigger vehicles. And the Northern Territory has got another similar little system. So we see that quite a lot with tankers as well, bulk tankers, and these are typically the triple, double, triple, quad road train space. And South Australia is doing more of that now too. So the delays there aren't quite so long because they've got a different system. But in the context of the NHVR, just be mindful of that it's a building process. You can always add more routes to the permit. And the other point I make, which we've had to do, is that this is quite a complex system. And whilst you've got experts like Ben and Bob and myself that do our parts, at the end of the day, the operator is running the transport task. And increasingly, we're saying you really need to make sure that. And often it was the business owner. In some cases, it'll be the business owner. Some cases, the fleet manager. Other cases, the fleet purchasing people. Other cases, it'll be the compliance officer that's tasked with tying it all together. And sometimes we've found that if it's left to a lowly compliance officer that's working a couple of days a week, they don't have the authority within the business to make decisions to get stuff done. And we can see long delays because the operator's expecting stuff to happen, but it's not getting done. So, for example, we might be waiting on a certification because load sensing valves haven't been fitted to the dolly, right? And we can't certify it until that work's been done. Or we're waiting on tyres to be fitted, waiting on IAP to be hooked up. So there's all these little complexities that needs to be tied together, and it doesn't just happen. If you're expecting the PBS assessor or the manufacturer to make it all magic happen for you, it's not. So that's a big takeaway. So we've had, for example, to have a weekly meeting to meet with the compliance officer within the business to make sure she's up to date on what needs to happen, and because it's just too much for her to take in, right?
To keep the momentum in it as well.
So that's another sort of thing to consider.
Yep. Les, can I guess trying to bring it to a bit of a conclusion, from a NHVR point of view, when do we start seeing blueprints similar to what Marcus was talking about with networks? I'm traveling out on the road and I see someone else operating an A double, similar to the old B double network, that once someone else had it, you can basically piggyback onto it rather than having to go through the whole process. Do you see that as something, I guess the frequency of the 30-metre A double on the road these days on the East Coast will increase exponentially, I would imagine. But do you see that sort of complexity being taken out of it, where I guess one company or one group go through the initial process and then it's sort of easy to then set up a network or a blueprint for those certain roads or that certain route, rather than having to go through a total PBS approval process?
Justin, thanks. That's a very good question. Just before I answer that, I just would like to have one comment about the previous discussions, which was very, very useful, I think, for most of the members here or the audience. That unfortunately, we have legislation which is not keeping up with the development of the PBS scheme. So, for instance, those single delivery permits, manufacturers, they used to use their trade plates and so on to deliver vehicles. With some of the PBS combinations, that's not possible because of different part of the legislation is not considering the PBS vehicles as such. So we are doing lots of work in the regulatory framework to make those things easier to deal with those current restrictions which apply for PBS combinations. But back to your question, we are currently working on a number of PBS notices, and I guess that's very, very important, or we see them important to get that certainty what we were talking about before for the access related issues. Currently, we are working on two. One is the experts here, they call it vanilla notice, which is PBS level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So it's going to be a different PBS notice because it's going to cover all the different levels from level 1 to level 4. And that would be based on vehicles within those theoretical length limits. So for instance, 20 meters for level 1, 26 for level 2, 36.5 for level 3, and 53.5 for level 4. All those combinations which meet the tier 1 bridge formula. And that notice is not too far away. We've got, I think, around 100 road managers outstanding in terms of getting the consent. So that means that we will be able to nominate networks right away when the notice is issued. Now, then the second one is those vehicles, what you were talking about, these vehicles for the heavier, the level 2B combinations, and they are very, very close. The first round will be based on the Victorian high productivity vehicle networks and using some of those reference vehicles, what they have approved in that network. So that's, I think, very, very close. I think we've got 20 outstanding road manager consents, what we are pushing for. So these two notices will be significant. That will be a significant change within the PBS framework. That's one thing. And then the other thing, what we are considering, that when the generic tire assessment method is introduced, we will trying to migrate some of the PBS combinations out of PBS and generating class 3 type of notices for the operation of PBS combinations. So that's going to be probably the next step to make it more practical for the industry and make the whole scheme easier to access and make it easier to operate PBS combinations.
Excellent, thank you for that, Les. And that's guess for the guys there, Ben, Marcus, and Bob. Unfortunately, Bob had to leave, but thank you guys very much for putting your time aside today to giving us a good understanding of it. It is an extremely complex system. It does have its benefits, but I think people should know what the system looks like, warts and all, and go into it very wide open and do the research before they sort of jump and put their money into those specific vehicles. There's, as Les said earlier, there's significant safety improvements for the industry, and generally the tanker industry is an early adopter of that type of technology. So it's a pretty important part of our industry that we need to continue to work on, educate people, and also try and refine it so that it becomes a much easier scope to work in. So to the guys that have been on the panel today, thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate your knowledge and willingness to help.